I hope like when people get sober is you're like, oh my gosh, all these like younger parts of you and inner parts of you, that the goal isn't to like get rid of them and make them grow up. And like, the goal is that they actually get to like live, and you get to like find this like more fullness of self. And then like your spouse gets to interact with that self.
Yeah.
And like, and then if you have kids, your kids get this more full version of you. And that's wild, right?
Yep.
So to me, that's like the hopeful thing. It's like, yeah, addiction sucks. Let's get rid of it so you can find you and your heart gets to like live. Because who the hell knows what's possible then? Like,
Right.
we can't
Ugh.
imagine what your life could look like that day. Like, and if you're the spouse, you can't imagine that either.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Insights from the Couch. I'm Laura and Colette, and we're here with Aaron Moore, who is a licensed mental health counselor and owner of Solace Counseling with his wife, Michelle. And he specializes in area of stigma, shame, mental health, addiction, and recovery. Welcome, Aaron. We're so psyched to have you to talk
Thanks
about.
for having me.
Colette and I, as we've talked to you before, we see so many women coming to counseling saying issues of alcohol use and substance use is such an issue in my marriage. And it's such a block. And they grind their gears, wanting their husbands to change, wanting their husbands to go to counseling, and seeing that like addiction issues are the things that's really blocking connection in their life. And just from a personal standpoint, I'll say that this is the issue that brought me to counseling with my husband for the first time. And we spent years going over this in a circular fashion of like processing the fallout and getting him to a place of like saying, hey, maybe alcohol isn't a great thing in my life. So I have personal experience with this and I see this all the time. So
Sure.
Tell us about what you see in counseling. Do you see men mostly?
I work with adults, kind of all across the board. I see a ton of men. I also work with a high amount of, female clients, and I do a lot of couples work. Couples work is one of the things I do the most of. And so that's where, Colette and I get to kind of go back and forth sometimes, which is really fun. But
agreed.
Yeah, it really is. I get kind of the view all across the board. And when I started as a therapist, I realized the other day it was almost 20 years ago. And I was like, oh my gosh, that flew. But one of the things that, one of my mentors, in my first jobs was all addiction related, and specifically a lot of substance use disorder work, as well as some sexual addiction recovery work. So that became kind of one of the other main areas that I work. So often I get couples and individuals, where that's the main issue. And I think y'all know too, I think we all run into situations where, you think the addiction's the main issue when somebody comes in, and you realize down the road it's not at all. And then other times people come in, I've had so many folks that, came in over the years addressing a family issue, or they want to talk about what's going on with the teenager. And then what really comes back to is substance use in the home and everything that kind of cascades down from that. So I see that, from a lot of different angles, and it's often, there's so many ways to think about it, but culturally it's such a strange thing, right? Because, our relationship with substances and thus addictions as a culture is such an interesting thing. So it's often something that can slide under the radar. Laura, I don't know your story, but it's something that can often slide under the radar for often like decades.
Right.
Oh, mine didn't slide under the radar.
Well,
it was right in your face, but I'm sure it can slide.
But it does, because our culture, specifically if we're talking about alcohol, that this may be changing a bit with the younger generations who seem to use way more marijuana, cannabis than alcohol. But for people, our age, midlife, 40 plus, let's say, alcohol is just a part of normal socialization. Sure. So for people who have a problem, it can be very difficult to distinguish what's truly problematic. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. Sure. I see a lot of confusion in my couples about, if something doesn't feel right, even if it's not the root issue, it's a block to connection and intimacy. So something doesn't feel right, but I don't want him to necessarily not drink. I just want him to drink normally. And is it a problem? And right, so much
Sure.
confusion on how to differentiate.
Totally. I think there's really great criteria. If you look at some of the criteria, for what we now call substance use disorder, but historically, I mean, we refer to it a million different ways, but it's where we kind of end up in this realm of addiction. But you see some of the classic things that you always hear talked about. That if somebody's tried to cut back multiple times, and often in the story, people have tried to cut back for years, and then it always kind of gets back to where it was, and then it also
Yes.
progresses. When substance abuse really kind of goes, off the tracks, things progress. Addiction's never static. Addiction's always dynamic. But where we kind of get a little bit, where we can miss that, is sometimes it's dynamic over 20 to 30 years, and sometimes it's dynamic over a month. But it does change. It's not static. The effects of it do grow over time, right? And so, another thing that comes to mind for me when I'm talking to folks, in that, because what you're describing, Colette, is that curious phase where we're kind of going, is this an issue? Is it not? I don't
Yeah.
know. Then I'm usually going, okay, well, what happens when it's happening? Like, how is life different? How is life different when somebody's using versus when they're not? Because if life's generally the same, then we go, okay, well, then what's that about? But often, there's some distinct differences if somebody's, drinking, and I wouldn't want to limit it to drinking either, because now, I mean, marijuana use is like way, 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 way more prevalent. And all the other addictions that like our society really celebrates, like being a workaholic. We love that one,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
So
Right. It's rewarded.
It's very functional.
totally. I mean, it is like literally like rewarded. You can get plaques on your wall for that one.
Right.
So weird, right?
And
But
money.
yeah, totally. I mean, like all kinds of good stuff. But when you're in that, what are the effects on the family? Like, what are the actual effects on the relationship? Like, are there negative effects? If so, if there are negative effects, what are they? And one of the biggest, kind of qualifiers of when things really go off the tracks are when we can go, yes, there are negative effects, but we keep doing it anyway.
There's so much denial, though. I mean, I think that it's not that bad. It's really not that bad.
Sure.
I mean, that's what I've heard. And I think that the person who's using and is so protective of using, really is into minimizing and normalizing what's happening. And
Yeah.
I think the partner, the non-using or the non-abusing partner, is also complicit a little bit in that, and going, well, he doesn't like drink every day. And there's, it's so confusing as to when does it rise to the level of like there are real consequences.
And that's the question of, are we willing to see the real consequences?
Yes.
Right. And so there's an element where, like you said, addiction it's always wrapped up in denial, but denial shows up different ways. I think the ways that come to mind for me that are really helpful, because I think, like to y'all's questions of how do we kind of know when it's going sideways, is we go, okay, how am I doing these things? And you mentioned, Laura, we minimize it. Like, we literally make more into less. I remember one of my mentors, decades ago was like, yeah, I mean, if somebody's really addiction and they're like, hey, I'm only drinking like 6 a night, that really means
I've heard that.
Right. Maybe more. Right?
Double it.
And do that. And that is that, but that's significant, because if you're a spouse, then you kind of have to learn to listen to, like, what's reality here? Like, are we going, oh, we just drink a little bit a night? No, that's actually like 3 bottles of wine a night, or that's 2 bottles of wine a night, or whatever, right? But we have to kind of go, wait a second, is there minimizing that's happening where we are literally making a number half of what it is? And that's kind of a hallmark. I think the other things that come to mind for me in that kind of denial category is we usually see a significant kind of element of rationalizing.
Yes.
Where we're able to go, yeah, but it's really not that bad. And here's all the reasons why it's not that bad.
Everybody does it. Like everybody drinks
does
this way. Yeah.
That is the best, like, high school, college response. Like, that's what our teenagers will tell us. They'll be like, but everybody does it. And you're like, well, then everybody's in trouble. Minimizing, rationalizing. And then I often find there's also this And I would kind of distinguish it from rationalizing. There's a justification element, and that usually has a sense of entitlement,
Ooh,
where, hey, I work hard, I deserve to feel good.
Yes.
Like we find a way to go, hey, you know what? Like, yeah, well, life isn't easy and I deserve to feel better right now. And that's something that, anybody who's kind of wrestled with addiction often finds in there. It's that space where we kind of go, no, no, no. This is why this is okay. This is why I deserve this in this moment. And so if you're a spouse, when you're kind of
Yes.
trying to go, hey, how much denial are we in? Because like y'all said, it's a team effort here. Denial usually takes like multiple people to get on board. That's not a ship of one. We can kind of go, wait a second, how are we kind of telling ourselves this is okay? Like how are we justifying that something that's probably not okay? How are we convincing ourselves that it is okay?
Oh my gosh, yes. Because
yeah.
as you're talking, Erin, I'm thinking about, when I get couples, rarely is it the first thing they say. I mean, I have had people come in and say, "We're here because my husband has a drinking problem." But, obviously that has to be addressed in and of
Mm-hmm.
itself, and that a person has to be willing to look at that. But for the most part, I'll ask about it if I see something on the paperwork. And I agree with you. People will usually underreport what they're drinking, whether they have a massive problem or
Sure.
not. But what I hear so often is, you know, I don't have DUIs. I haven't lost my job. I'm thriving in my career. I only drink when we go out and socialize, but that ends up being, 3, 4, 5 nights a week. Everybody else is drinking too, but that spouse is the one who has 7, 8, or 9 drinks, and maybe they don't act totally wasted and out of control. But if you are imbibing to that degree, you are not present, and it is going to take a toll on your
Mm-hmm.
relationship as well as your own mental health, even if there aren't these big outward discernible signs. So it seems very easy to slip into that denial for a lot of people.
For some people, it's hard to even recognize that that's denial because that's good enough. And
Yes.
like that level of connection is kind of
Yeah.
like as good as they've known. So it's like, okay, this is just what it is.
Yes.
Mm,
Right. And so like one of the things, like how I kind of encounter that, I think, as a therapist is just, those times when you're going, I mean, you're almost just hoping that you can go, wait a second, what does it look like if we dream about what could be a little better? Like what does it look like? Like what would actually like what would you really want? And so I run into this space where with couples or individuals in kind of in this area is going, okay, if we can figure out how to like listen to what I really want and how I feel about where things really are, then it actually starts to shine a spotlight on, oh man, it could be better. And so that's where
I
I mean,
love
kind of
that.
go back to that question, like how do you know? I actually think we often get too hung up on whether or not we want to call something an addiction
Yes.
because people are going, well, I think it's okay. It's not really a problem. And I'm like, okay, fine. Maybe it's not a problem and it's not an addiction, but maybe that's also not the point. Maybe the
Yes.
point would be, hey, like, I don't like the way that we end up arguing 4 nights a week. And it seems like we're usually, drinking or smoking or doing something. So maybe we would like our life and our relationship to be a little better. And so but a lot of times we get hung up on this, like we have to call it substance abuse and an addiction, or that's the problem. And often it can be for sure. But sometimes I feel like the doorway is just going, hey, I don't like how this is going. And I'd love for it to be different. So let's talk about what's happening and how it could be better.
yeah.
Love that. Because it's so true, right? People want to say, well, is he an alcoholic? Am I an alcoholic or not? I'm not an alcoholic. Who cares? Like, let's look at if there's curiosity, there's some reason there's curiosity, and let's look at
Mhm.
the impact it's having, not get hung up on the labels and diagnoses.
Yeah. And that's where then you get to kind of explore like, okay, well, what impact is it having on the relationship? What is it impact is it having on the family? And then if we can actually, and even like between couples, if we can talk about that, I mean, couples that can begin to have that conversation are going to be fine.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's like if you can get there, you'll figure out the rest of the way. And even if you get like that kind of openness and curiosity, especially between the couple, I see that when that gets down the road, it may be 6 months down the road, and then one of the partners might be like, "Hey, you know what? I realized I am an alcoholic," and it's actually like kind of like a beautiful thing because then for them, they're free to be like, "Whoa, we just got real curious about that and talked about that and worked on that, and I'm still getting blasted out of my mind 6 months later. I must be an alcoholic. Now let me go do the things that people who have addictions do, which is all the wonderful steps to getting into recovery."
You're describing a really gentle process that sounds really beautiful, but
Go
I've
ahead.
seen like more of street fight, between partners where
Sure.
especially like a man will say like I'm not giving, maybe they're way more attached to their social group. Like the men they're attached to, the men they drink with, that's almost more of a primary source of connection for them than their marriage.
Right.
Mhm.
Drinking on the golf course, drinking
Yeah.
at the business dinners,
Yeah. Like, and they're like, I'm
drinking with
not
the
giving
boys.
that up. I'm not giving it up. And
Mhm.
so it's much more of a street fight. And the partner who is like, you gotta give this up somehow, is so angry and disconnected
Mhm.
that it's like every time there's no room for experimentation. It's kind of like every time he goes and, drinks at the watering hole and doesn't come home till 3 in the morning, it's it's a mess and it's a fight. And it's so I haven't seen the gentle version, the curious version of this very often. By
Well,
the
I think
time I see it, it's pretty,
mhm,
polarized.
what I'm describing includes a lot of what you're describing because I kind of see it in that context. I just know when like a lot of the couples I sit with, when we come in and they're in that street fight place, um, that's like the hardest place in
Yeah.
many ways, because then it really becomes about like, I mean, in any kind of relational dynamic, if it's you can't do this, that's not a good start,
No.
because then how do we actually that doesn't create any kind of safety that we can connect, you know
And
and that
explore
doesn't
it.
create any, yeah, that doesn't even set up, the spouse that's hurting, that doesn't even set them up with a safe space to be able to like vulnerably share how they're being impacted. I'm usually trying to help people not be in a space where, the spouse, that's not abusing substances feels like they have to be in that, like, hey, okay, let me give you the list of things you can't do, and
Yeah.
that's like in any man, I mean, I know y'all see this all the time. Like, I mean, couples come in, and especially if somebody's come in and they're like, hey, I have a problem, and maybe it's alcohol, maybe it's another substance, maybe it's sexual addiction behaviors, and often like the very helpful wife, if that's the dynamic, is like, yeah, like I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna make sure you do that, and all those wonderful kind of codependent steps of like making sure they do it, and so I personally, I end up like usually right off the bat, I'm like, okay, here's a bunch of things that are probably not going to be helpful. So let's really try to get out of that dynamic because I don't want either person to get back in that kind of street fight place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
And
then, Erin, you're saying if we're trying to help people understand if this is going on for you and you are angry and you're fed up, no
Mhm.
matter how you're feeling, the place to start with is a conversation of an exploration. We're a team, we're a family. Can we look at how this is affecting us? Can we open up a dialogue where I can share with you how I'm being impacted on my end, and you can share with me what's going on with you? And we can talk about, do we need help? And how's this affecting our kids? And, what do we do next as a couple? Where you've got to work on your own mental health and I've got to work on my own, but we're still a unit and we're going to start a curious dialogue and an exploration.
We were talking a minute before we started. The amount of times I have people come in and want to talk to me about, my spouse is doing this.
Yeah.
I'm going to get him in to come see you.
Yeah.
yep. Yep. Yep.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
I've
wait a
heard
second.
that
Oh,
So
yeah.
too.
so you're gonna send him in to see me. Automatic bad start. Like that's
Right.
not good. It's like, hey, there's some dude in downtown. Go talk to him because you're in trouble. Oh, great. This
You're
is gonna
going to the
go really
principal's
well.
office. Mom is
Yeah,
sending you to the principal.
like not cool. Like it's never gonna go well.
Right.
Um, and because nothing that makes a grown ass man feel like a 14-year-old in trouble in the principal's office is going to bring you something good. So many folks haven't really asked their spouse, or they've skipped the questions that I feel like can kind of open doors.
Can
And
you
I'm
give
aware
some
a lot of times,
examples of those
yeah.
questions?
I mean, being able to say, hey, like you said a second ago, you said, can we talk about this?
Yeah.
Can we talk about how like might be like affecting us?
Yeah.
Or hey, have you ever thought that maybe we drink too much? Have you ever been concerned about the level that we're drinking, or have you ever been concerned about the level that you're drinking? Have you ever been concerned about the amount of marijuana you're using or how it might be affecting us? And I'm aware when people are really far down the road, those conversations can be met with a lot of anger and pushback.
Yeah.
I still believe that's where you start.
Agreed.
Regardless, yeah.
Like, because whether or not somebody can hear it in that moment, it does get taken in. If for no other reason, then you put that little question in their brain, in the back of their mind, right? Just because now that question has been spoken aloud. The things that we don't speak out loud don't get to really become real.
Yes.
So being able to put that and let that like have flesh and blood in the room, man, like that's just a great place to start. And even then, because then like if down the road it's like, hey, I really want you to go to counseling and talk about where we're at with me, then it's very different to have been going, hey, I've tried to talk to you about this for 3 months, and we're struggling to talk about it. So I think we need somebody to help us talk about that.
You're breaking through the denial
Mm-hmm.
and acknowledging what's real, which is such a critical and powerful step.
Yeah.
And it's a process, right? Like those conversations have to happen maybe over and over and over
Yeah.
again. Yeah.
Yeah.
And can
Yeah.
you talk to like our prototypical listener who's like middle-aged woman who might be dealing with this? Where's the best place? If she's going to her husband or her partner and saying like, "Look, I think this is an issue. Can we talk about it?" And he's basically telling her to go kick rocks because it's not a problem. Where do you recommend her starting? Where's her work if she
Yeah.
wants to begin to work on this?
Yeah. If she wasn't already doing individual counseling, I would definitely say do that.
Yeah.
Right. I think that is the place to start. And I think that's actually like really vital. I mean, obviously, like support group stuff is really helpful when you're at the space like you're describing, Laura, where you're kind of not, even where you're not really sure fully what's happening. Like if you're going, I'm not even really sure, then like Al-Anon stuff can be really helpful. But digging into your own individual work that can help go, okay, wait a second. Here's some of what's going on in me. Like here's my role in the system that we've kind of built. But also here's what it's stirring up in me. And then you have another voice that helps you figure out, okay, here's what you've tried. Here are, 4 or 5 other roads to kind of explore and go down and trying to figure out how do I communicate. If it's a wife and I'm asking my husband, a million times, hey, will you go do this? Will you go do this? Will you go do this? Obviously, sometimes you get to the space where you really kind of have to up the ante, and it's because it's a bigger deal. That's like such a road to get sucked down as an individual,
Yeah.
where you're doing so much mental work trying to figure out how to get somebody else to do something
Ooh,
differently. And it's like, I get why we get there. Like, I mean, when you feel like, I mean, it's like when you feel like you have somebody walking around the house every night with a flamethrower, randomly setting stuff on fire, your brain is naturally going to go, hey, how do we get him to stop doing that every day?
Yeah.
How do we get the guy to stop carrying the flamethrower around? You know, um, completely makes sense. But then we spend so much work and effort and energy down this road of trying to get somebody to do something, as opposed to like the ways in which we kind of invite somebody to change while knowing where we stand and
Right.
communicating, hey, this is where I really feel like we need to go. This is what I need. And sometimes we get to the space where it's like, hey, I need you to meet me here. And if you can't come do this with me, or if we can't find a way to get in the door and get some help, then I may have to take steps for
yeah.
my own sanity.
Yes,
And that's
not
a
a
place
threat, a
together, right?
boundary. A
Yeah.
boundary.
Yeah,
And
for
knowing where
sure.
you stand and focusing on what you can control. And I wonder, listening to you, Aaron, And Laura, if well, we were chatting before we got on a little bit about your story, can you share a little more of that? Because what Erin's saying kind of reminds me of what you shared about your own journey.
Which part?
Just about what you went through with your husband, like some of the actual
Yeah.
process and how you experienced it, because I think that's really helpful for people.
The way it showed up was he wasn't a constant drinker, but when he drank. And it was always around like celebratory weddings, parties, going out to dinner. And it became, and he has just a temperament that when he drinks, it tends not to like calm him down. It tends to ramp
Mm,
him up and become very agitated and combative. And so the night would always end poorly. And to the
Yeah.
point where it's like you're going out for a nice dinner and you just don't want to go. You're just like, I was like crying before I was like, I don't want to do this night. I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
So we would go to counseling, and he was very protective of this because this was his socialization, behavior, and he loved it. And he didn't see it as a problem. It was only occasionally a problem. It was always like playing a game of Russian roulette. It could go fine, but it could be awful too.
Yeah.
So we went around and around, and it just took so much time in the therapist's office deconstructing everything that happened. And finally, we got to a place where we were sober as a couple for about 6 years. But it was tough. And
yeah,
he's come back to alcohol. He's somebody who probably I'll never feel great about the way he drinks, but it's totally different than it was. And I feel like a lot of people probably should just say no to alcohol at this point. I'm
sure.
I'm probably in the low to no alcohol camp. I don't even like watching people drink
Yeah.
anymore. But he's come to a place that's much more sane. But yeah, it was a big process. It wasn't for the faint of heart. It took a lot out of me.
Sure.
It was years of negotiating through that. So I think you have to have ego strength, and you have to have commitment to the relationship, and like you said, you have to do all that work of where do I stand, and knowing how you feel. But I
Well,
don't
and
know if
that's
that's
where,
what you were thinking of,
Yeah.
what part you wanted.
I'm so glad you're sharing that because I just think it helps to hear other people's stories and how hard this is, how nonlinear.
It's
And
nonlinear.
yeah,
Yeah.
did you have to, Laura, well, since you're talking about this, did you have to lay boundaries at any point or come to
Yeah.
a place of saying,
Yeah.
if this
100%.
isn't going to change, what am
Yeah,
I
like
going to do?
I think, well, for me, I said I'd rather live in my car. That was the moment for me. And I was like, I would rather live in my car. That's information, right? When I got to that place, I knew. And I think a therapist said to me, and I love this question. He says, how will you know when you're done with this?
Ugh.
And that question like just sat with me. And I was like, yeah, how will I know when I'm done? And when you reach that point, it's very authentic, right? It's not threatening. It
I'm
doesn't come from a
leaving.
false, place. It comes from a very solid place of like, I'm done. I think I'd rather live in my car.
Yeah, like
It's
if
very
this
quiet.
continues, I'm not
Yeah, I can't
going.
do
I've
it.
reached a place where
It's
I'm
not,
not
I don't
willing.
respect myself for staying in this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And once you reach that point, I think your partner knows. And he was at that point. We'd had enough of those conversations going
yeah.
around and around that he was like, okay, I get it.
Well, and
Wow.
and then I love hearing you say that because that's a little different. Um, that's a different approach, Laura, than trying to get your husband to stop drinking.
Yes.
It
Like that's
started
what.
there.
Sure. I mean, well, most all of our relational stuff starts with I'm trying to get you to do something differently. Yeah,
Totally.
but it's like when we kind of like listen and dig in, and it's like, oh crap, that's not the thing. I mean, like the statement, as heady as that is, like I'd rather live in my car. That's a statement about what you need and how you need him to care for and love you, right?
For sure.
And I know that might not connect with everybody, but like that's a very different space than I need to get my husband to stop drinking. Like that's a different space because that's a space where I'm asking my spouse to really hear what I need, the boundaries that if it can't be met, then this is where I have to go. And that's why like that individual work, I think is like so important because it helps me go, okay, here's what I can do and here's what I can't.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
This is the point that if I stay in it, I'm not in a good healthy space.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. That's exactly right. I'm
And
diminishing
that
the,
is a huge differential and such a shift, right? And I think it's so important what both of you just said about how realistically, the way human beings work, we maybe don't start there. It sounds great in theory. I'm going to focus on me and what I can control. And even though that's right, it's just not human that we start there most of
No,
the
not at
time,
all.
right?
Yeah,
If something's hurting you, it's human nature to go, I want to stop the thing that's hurting me.
yeah.
But through the process, and if you're willing to be curious and really search within and connect to yourself, you can get to the place of going, okay, what does this mean for me? And given that I don't have control, can I invite? Can I get curious? Can I let my partner know the impact and where I stand and make choices for me based on what is or isn't happening? Because that's really all you can do, but you may have to journey to get there.
Sure.
It's tough.
It is. Well, and that's what I mean. And yeah, it's often like, I mean, it's super messy. It's super painful. Like y'all said, it's nonlinear, and the goal of like sitting, in couples therapy and individual therapy, but y'all both mentioned like, a lot of the anger that happens in that, right? And I think of like couples that, I work with that our goal is to just help the anger be heard.
yeah.
I mean, when you're in a long term, like, addiction driven, often there's addiction and codependency relationship. Like, we're so dysregulated. Our nervous systems are so interwoven in the worst of ways. It takes a long time to, for couples to be able to sit where I can hear your anger because you're now sharing with me your hurt, and I'm able to hear it in a way where I'm not automatically keyed up in the same way, and we're just deciding who's going to be in more fight or flight and how we're going to do that.
Yeah.
It's a long-term hope is creating that space, not where spouses don't get to share the hurt and share the anger, but where you get to share it, it's actually really heard.
Yes.
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know
that is
Yes.
like the hope merchant piece of it, right? Because like if you can trust this process, go through this process, meet
Mhm.
this process, and it's not easy, you can actually get a way better marriage. And people don't get that, but you
Hell
can.
yes.
I mean, I'm living proof of that. Like I
Yeah,
don't have a perfect marriage, but we fought that battle and we are way more connected because of that.
for
And we had to
sure.
get out of that loop you were talking about.
Isn't that like the funnest thing about doing couples work though? Like,
Okay,
I mean,
maybe.
man, well, I like, look, I love it because like
Me
when
too.
I like, it makes me think of like, when you're working with, people who have experienced affairs in their relationship, and like one of the most common things is that like, I want to get back to where we were. So they go through the phase where they try and be really romantic or have sex more or like act like they did when they were like 25. And I'm like, this is never going to work because you can't go back there. And when you realize that like what could lie ahead is so much better
Mhm.
than where you
Yes.
were, you're going to look back and be like, thank God we couldn't go backwards. So it's not like, let's get back to when the relationship was really good pre when you started smoking pot every day. It's like, no, let's grow through that. And if we go through that, we're going to get to the other side and it's going to be way better than it was before because we
I-
will have done like work together. And
Yes.
I love
It's
that.
so
I
true.
love when it's like that. It's so fun for me.
Yeah. And people don't always realize that a much better relationship is possible if you can go through what needs
Sure.
to happen to get there. So I think you're so right, Aaron. And I know what I see as I only work with couples now is sometimes people come in and this is the beginning of a process that sets them on the path of a much better marriage.
Mm.
And I don't see it as a one size fits all. We're taught, just for the listener, we're taught as therapists that, alcohol abuse is a contraindication for couples therapy, but it's not cut and dry. And there are
Mhm.
couples where I have to say, I really think you need to get your own treatment before this
For
process
sure.
would be fruitful. And then there are many when I say, I think we've got to be working on this, but we can do it concurrently.
Yeah.
And in fact, it would be better for it to be concurrent and not just leave
Yep.
what's already happening with disconnection in the relationship on ice. So it just depends. But I had a couple, such a sad situation where the husband had a drinking problem. He admitted he had a drinking problem. I thought it was pretty extreme, the degree of the problem, but I agreed to work with them since they were both willing to be honest and open. And he was willing to also do his own individual work. And we spent a year and a half meeting, and he just could not and would not give up drinking. And the relationship was slowly going down the drain. And the wife kept saying, I really want this, but if this doesn't change, I will have to leave. And she wasn't
Yeah.
threatening. It was just this really tragic situation. And ultimately, he did not stop drinking. And then she
Yeah.
had to make a very difficult choice. And
Yep.
I'm not saying that's the typical thing, but it's a possibility that at the end of the road, your partner may
For sure.
not change. And then all you really can do is decide, do you want to feel like you'd rather live in your car the rest of your life? And weigh that cost and balance.
Like in that kind of scenario you're describing, somebody who's willing to do like a year and a half of like deep work and working on themselves, after a year and a half, they are going to be less able to stay.
Right.
Like you keep, if when
Right.
you keep getting healthy, and
Yeah.
that's the whole thing. Like we're like often like, I mean, we know addiction's kind of usually a system. If it's been going on for a couple decades, like, usually like it involves, kind of both partners, pretty integrated there. And when one person kind of disrupts that system and really keeps working on themselves, they're not able to go back and stay in that system. Like,
That's so
so
Exactly.
true. So
like
She
true.
got healthier.
which is also a little bit of like the
Yeah.
hopeful place of going, hey, if you really feel like your spouse is kind of off the rails, one of the benefits of you doing your own work is it's only going to make things clearer to you.
Exactly.
I run into that a lot where folks are like, well, I'm fine. We got to fix my husband. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, I mean, things are only going to get clearer for you. You're only going to find better ways to be really honest. He may not change at all, but you will be changing. And so he will be more and more kind of, he's going to be heading down that
Yeah.
road of, well, dude, you either got to kind of come with, or this isn't happening.
The system will be
Yes.
disrupted somehow.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah. 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 So
Yeah.
I don't want to open up a huge can of worms, but I want to talk about the idea. And I've heard this all the time. And when it comes to addiction work, is that when people start drinking at a certain age, 14, 16, 18, whatever, and
Oops.
they've drank their whole lives as sort of an exit and a coping mechanism, that it's like they almost stop growing. They never
Yeah.
like feel their way through a feeling. So that when you're in marriage counseling with a person who's drank since they're 16, you're very often emotionally dealing with like a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
Do you hear that? I mean, is that something you kind
Yeah.
of
I mean, that's Arrested Development is not just a television show.
Right, right. So like what do you see in some of these people who have like, men especially, because I'm curious about the emotional lives of men and this, they look like they've got
okay.
great jobs, they're, but they are
Yeah.
emotionally like 16.
Yeah. Okay.
That's another five
Y'all can
hours.
edit. Y'all
No,
can
but
edit.
this is good. I want to hear it too.
Yeah.
Okay. Y'all can edit me later.
No, no, spill
I
it.
love the question. I love the question, Laura, and I'm right with you. But here's why I'm kind of smiling, and my initial reaction is I kind of had a little bit of like a, one of the patterns I see often is that we our response to men who struggle with addiction is really patronizing, and I kind of tend to get protective of men in that space, because I think they get shamed a lot. I mean, if we shame the 40-year-old man and we're shaming the 16-year-old inside of him, neither is helpful.
Mm, yeah.
Shame and guilt are really powerful motivators for like really short-term recovery, and they're really powerful long-term motivators for like death and destruction. Earlier when we were talking about men, you mentioned, like men being protective of their addictions and the things that they're using, right? Well, somebody who's drank since they were 16, If they're 50 and they've been drinking consistently and it developed into a coping mechanism, right? Most like
Right.
where and we're not just talking about somebody who had their first beers at 16, and I mean we're talking about like where we're talking about unhealthy drinking to cope for multiple decades, right? Where it would have some of the hallmarks of addiction, where it's caused pain and disruption in the family, people have been hurt, there's always a cost, right? When that's the case, I always try and really respect like their substance of choice, because that is the longest, most consistent, dependable relationship they've ever had in their life. If I'm going to ask them to give up a relationship that has been more dependable for them than their parents were, I better have a really good reason. And I better help them find something else that they can connect to in the world. Because if not, then I'm being like, hey, man, that thing that's helped you feel sane and grounded in your life, just stop doing that. I think that's important because I think all of us have places where we kind of got stuck. I mean, I'm very aware of kind of the 15, 16-year-old in me, and some younger, parts and pieces. But when we kind of get there, if I do, I mean, your question is right on. If I do kind of get to that space where I start using something to cope, it also shows up in sexual addiction, with men really commonly, where I use this thing to cope, then yeah, like if I drink every time everything is really bad and I drink every time everything is really good, I never learned how to experience really bad or really good without it being muted or distorted by a substance.
Right.
Right. If every time I run into depths of insecurity, I go medicate that, by, a romantic fling or hookup or something like that, then I never learn how to like sit with those and wrestle with those. And it's understandable, like to be married to somebody that like you keep running into their 16-year-old self repeatedly, especially in times of every time of difficulty you run into that. That's really hard. But how do 16-year-olds respond when we shame them and get angry at them?
Yeah. I
Like,
love that compassionate frame. I love
you
that.
know,
Like I feel that. And what it does set up is like what you're saying is like the mother son dynamic, like
yo,
like that adolescent, young kid, and then the mom who's like, get your shit together.
yeah. And as a
It's not
wife,
cute. It's not a sexy dynamic.
I'm just assuming you don't want to like have to like be like checking your husband's texts and making sure he didn't stop somewhere on the way home from work and making sure
Right.
like trying to sniff his breath before you go to bed at night. Like
It's
that's
the
awful.
worst.
That's also not a dynamic we want to develop with a 16-year-old son either.
And I also think what's great about what you're saying too is that it is important to understand, we're therapists, but I think it's important for all of us as people to understand that this thing that's creating so much disconnection and possibly destruction in your life and family, this addiction, not that it's okay, but it may be a very long-standing coping mechanism. And the only reliable relationship that this person has had since childhood. And that's a big part of why it's not so easy to just stop, right? Because people are like,
Sure.
just stop. Like, look at this. It doesn't make sense. It's not that easy. And we have to
Totally.
respect that connection as we also hold our boundaries and say, hey,
For
look, I
sure.
get why this is this thing for you. And this is what it's doing now. It's no longer
Yep.
serving.
Many of the survival skills that a lot of us picked up in adolescence worked really well until about 24, 25, and they slowly start to kill us.
Totally.
But, they just do, like, and that's just what it is. Like a lot of my friends that are in recovery and that work in the recovery community, if they were listening to me right now, they'd be like, yeah, but dude, but you gotta like make sure people like get honest. And because I think there is this mix, like addiction, it is really helpful to remember addiction always distorts reality, right? Like, and that's where like denial comes in. Like addiction literally like distorts reality. So it has to be met with a lot of honesty. And so, yes, that means like if we're sitting in couples counseling, we're trying to help the spouse who's been hurt speak very clearly and very honestly about the depth of the hurt and the destruction and the pain, because it has been minimized and rationalized away and obscured, right? But if we don't have this like flip side of compassion with it, then the honesty cannot be received.
Yes.
Yeah.
Honesty without compassion is literally just shaming. And shaming's also always going to send me back into, my isolated spirals. Like what we don't realize is like for most people who have been on an addiction cycle for a long period of time, shame is actually the driving factor. Because every time they fall back into it, they feel like a total piece of shit. You have a wonderful coping mechanism for when you feel like a piece of shit. If we're just reinforcing the shame, we're not giving anybody anything to connect to. But if we're also being really compassionate without talking about just how awful it is and how dangerous it is and how, it's going to cost a life or a marriage, or if we're not honest about that, then we're kind of just in the enabling codependent part. And we're kind of going, yeah, maybe it's not that bad.
Exactly. So get honest, but it's got to be with compassion, or it's just going to shame spiral and not get anyone anywhere.
Sure.
Yeah. And so like such a, a marketing thing for therapy, but like I'm assuming like the average person is just not awesome when they're totally flooded by anger or, rage about what's going on in their marriage or their life to thread that needle. I don't always get it right of compassion and honesty. So it's like, this is where sometimes you just need to get help and people to help you with that process.
Well, and like, yeah, I so much so, like, because when you're in that cycle, I mean, I don't know if the two of y'all see this, but when you're in that cycle, people are so isolated.
Yeah.
Like that spouse that's married to somebody with, substance use disorder or some type of addictive behavior, often I find they're talking about it with others very rarely. Like maybe they talk about it with their mother, maybe they talk about it with one or two friends, but then when I ask, they're usually not even really telling the truth about how bad it is.
Right.
And so when you're in that home and you can't speak honestly somewhere about the reality of what's happening, you will have a hard time understanding the reality of what's happening within yourself.
Before we wrap up here, one thing I just want to say, and then, I want to give you the floor to say anything else you think is important before we do wrap up, but is that to what we started with, people get hung up on the diagnosis and is it a problem or isn't it? But for the listener, if something feels off, even if you keep pushing it to the back of your mind and going, oh, I can't deal with this now. And maybe it's not that big of a deal and things aren't so bad, honor that part of you that's telling you something about this isn't right. Because you're not going to feel that way if there isn't something that's off. And that's worth exploring, even though it may be a journey. Anything else, Erin, that you think is really important for our listener to know about this? Because it is such an isolating, challenging thing to deal with.
And
Yeah,
common.
it is so isolating when you're in it. And that's why I think it's important to remember millions of people have done this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that's what I find myself telling people also who come in like trying to work through an affair or something is I'm like, oh my gosh, you're in luck. You want good news? Good news is that like millions of people have actually figured it out and worked through it. And they're in such a good place that you can't imagine is real right now, but I promise you it's real. But you can't imagine it. It's okay, you can't imagine it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It does, but you really need support to get through it. Whether you're the spouse who's struggling with substance or you're the spouse of somebody who's struggling with substance, you need support that just helps us see clearly. When you're in it, like the truth and reality becomes so foggy. And so, if you're struggling, I mean, obviously, like the three of us are going to push therapy. Therapy is really, really helpful. One of the things I find myself saying to people, though, I loved your question, Colette, is like, when you're kind of going, hey, something feels off. A really helpful thing that follows that for me is something feels off. What that could mean is that something could be better.
Oh, I
Love
love
that.
it. It's like
If
hope.
something feels off, then something could be better. And if you're
Yeah.
going, man, what do I do? Then just go, okay, what is one person I know that I might be able to have that safe conversation with? What is one friend? What is one family member? What is one person that I could go, hey, I'm kind of wondering this, and just see what they have to say. See
Yeah.
what door
Just
that is.
start the conversation.
For spouses who are struggling with addiction, I think it's the same thing. It's being able to go, hey, you know what? I think this might not be good for me. And I've told that to men I've worked with, or I'm like, hey, why don't you just go ask? Like, go ask. And they come back and they're like, yeah, my brother thinks I'm a raging alcoholic. I'm like, cool.
Information.
They're like, who knew? I'm like, well, I think everybody knew, but you're just finding out. That's
But
okay.
you.
People aren't that polite in my family system, but whatever. It's
And I
great.
love that way of looking at it, right? If something feels off and I'm willing to face that, then that means something could be better. And who's that one person in my life that I might be able to go have an honest conversation and just start to admit something to myself and explore what could be better? Because then that's a pathway to, all right, what do I need to do next in service of what could be better? That's how you get honest. That's
Mhm.
how you're going to find your way. And that's how you're not
Yeah.
going to get as trapped in the spiral of angry,
Yep.
shaming demands that are focused on trying to change your partner.
Yeah. I mean, the other things that come to mind, just to answer your question,
Yeah,
what else do we say? One, I do think it's really important that if somebody, is struggling, they need to see a therapist that does work with addiction.
good point.
I run into
100%.
that often, is not everybody works with addiction.
No,
And so that can't be like, to really do that work. Because if you find if someone and their spouse finds, man, no, this is what's going on, then you need somebody that is a main part of what they do. That's not something that you can kind of armchair,
I
because
so agree.
we do
me
need to
too.
remember, like, I mean, addiction is life and death. It's not like, oh man, I don't like this, I don't like the way you act when you smoke weed. It's like, no, like it's gonna, addiction is, a matter of life and death and marriage and divorce, and whether or not you're going to maintain relationships with your kids. I mean, it's a,
It's a big
so
thing.
we have to, we talk about compassion, and obviously that's my main thing. But when you find yourself down that road, and one of two things happens: either we go, man, okay, somebody's really in crisis and we're worried for their life, then you need somebody who is going to go, okay, here are the steps we take to do an intervention. Here are the places that we connect with to get somebody into inpatient treatment. Here are the places that we got to go if somebody needs detox. You need to know that stuff, because you don't want to be Googling that stuff on a Sunday afternoon when shit has hit the fan,
No,
right?
and you also need a therapist who knows and has worked with
Yes.
addiction, or they could really actually end up unwittingly colluding with it. So I think that's a great point, Erin, and maybe something, if you are going to start a process of seeking therapy for yourself as a couple or both, ask the therapist,
Yep.
what's your experience in working with addiction? Because if they
Yeah.
don't have much or any, it's probably not going to be the best fit.
Yeah. And some of the best therapists I know don't like working with it. Whereas I'm like, I'm down. I really enjoy it. But some of the best therapists I know, they're like, that's not what I do. I'm like, cool, great.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
because they know their niche.
Yeah.
But being
Yeah.
able to know that, I think is being able to have those kind of resources is really huge.
Yeah.
Um,
Agreed.
Well,
so
thank you so much for this conversation. I got a lot out of it. I mean, I
Me too.
just some of the honest, the compassion, that you're doing both, and the framing around that is just awesome. And it's helped me a ton. I hope it's helped our
cool,
listener.
Yeah, me
cool.
too. I got a lot out of it. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Erin. You're such a wealth of knowledge and just really
Uh,
dynamic and interesting.
Thank you. I enjoy y'all. This is really fun. I like y'all leave me feeling like all encouraged. I'm like, cool.
But I
Yeah,
feel encouraged. I
Yeah.
feel like
me
excited
too.
about
Me
how
too.
awesome people's marriages can be when they get through this stuff.
And how there is life, better life on the other side. Like, and millions of people go through this. Because
Yeah.
of shame, we don't talk about it as
Yeah.
openly, but it is a normal part of the life journey for so
Yep.
many people that can be so much better. And I think that's just a great takeaway for everyone. This is not all, doomsday.
Yeah.
You just got to
No,
put
not at
in the
all.
work. You got to
Yeah,
put in
Well, and
the
that's
work.
okay. Okay, I gotta say, can I say one more
Yeah,
thing?
of
of
course.
Like,
course.
Laura, your question about, like, and maybe I'll bug y'all to, like, we can do this again and talk about men.
I would
But
Yeah.
love that.
like, you talk about, like the inner kind of emotional lives of men in there, right? And gosh, like, y'all, it's so cool. I don't know why that makes me feel emotional. It is really cool when you get to watch somebody find an inner life that they didn't know they had.
Hmm.
Yes.
And so that's like, and that's the hope. Like when people get sober, is you're like, oh my gosh, there are these like, there are all these like younger parts of you and inner parts of you, that the goal isn't to like get rid of them and make them grow up and like the goal is that they actually get to like live, and you get to like find this like more fullness of self, and like, and then like your spouse gets to interact with that self,
Yeah.
and like, and then when you, if you have kids, your kids get this more full version of you, and that's wild, right?
Yep.
You know, so to me, that's like the hopeful thing. Is it's like, yeah, addiction sucks. Let's get rid of it so you can find you, and your heart gets to like live. Because who the hell knows what's possible then? Like,
Right.
we can't
Ugh.
imagine what your life could look like that day. Like, and if you're the spouse, you can't imagine that either. Like when we're in it, we're like, oh, if he could just get sober, everything would be fine. It's like, no, if he gets sober, who knows what's gonna happen? Like, that could be, yeah, really
But
cool.
Oh, I have
finding the
goosebumps.
inner
Yeah.
life you didn't know you had. I
Yeah.
love that. And that's really the true reward of all of this. What's possible when your heart can live and you discover your rich inner world and can share that with another human being. I mean, it gives me goosebumps too.
I literally, I was like, oh, that,
Yeah.
yeah,
Get that
man,
internal family working.
And
that's the,
that's why we love the work we do, right? That's
Yeah.
the
yeah, dude.
reward of being therapists is helping people connect to themselves more deeply and see how they come to life and just flourish.
Well, and we've all been like, just, most of us never knew like what to do with those parts of ourselves, and kind of still don't, you know,
We
to
still
some
don't.
degree, right? But it does change when we start to go, wait a second, those aren't bad parts of me.
Right.
Like that part of your spouse that wants to get hammered, that's not a bad part of them.
Right.
That
No.
part just has a really bad plan and it's stuck in a really not helpful way of trying to
Yeah.
manage, you know, and squash an inner life that they don't know how to engage. But it's not, you know, it's not a bad part. It's just a part that doesn't know how to live in the world, you know. And so when we begin to approach ourselves that way, it does open us up, and vice versa, where we can approach, you know, each other that way. And it's like, hey, yeah, I love all of you, but like 16-year-old, you can't keep getting hammered every night in our marriage, because I that's not gonna work. Like,
Yeah.
you know, so
Yeah.
but yeah,
Love that
opens up a lot.
16-year-old. We've just got to
Yeah.
help that 16-year-old get a better plan going for now.
Yeah, he rides in the back. He rides in the
He
back
rides in
seat.
the back. He
Does not
can't drive.
Drive
Does
the
not drive the
car.
car. Like,
Right.
you know, come on. Like,
Right. Amen to
yeah.
that. Well, Erin, you have to come back
Yes.
again.
I want to do a deep dive on the internal life of men.
Yes.
The internal family
Yes.
system
So
of
fun being
men.
with y'all.
The
So
middle-aged
fun.
man.
Yes. So we hope you'll come back again
For sure.
and really enjoyed it. Thank you so
Yes.
much.